The actual idea came from Karen Stein, who was an editor at another publisher, and I think they were looking for a textbook. So it was really meant to be something that students could use to try to understand modern architecture. I told her that I didn't want to just make a list of buildings like some of those histories are, but that I want to make an argument. She thought that was fine, but in the end it became more of an argument and less of a recitation of buildings. But the real idea, at least for the way I then conceived of the book, goes back much, much further. You know, I grew up in the Netherlands, and when I was in high school, we had to do a little paper on De Stijl, the movement De Stijl. And my teacher said, well, you seem to like buildings and things like that. I have a friend who lives in a house that's a three-dimensional Mondrian. That friend turned out to be Mrs. Schroeder-Schrader of the Rietveld house. So she sent me off to her on my bicycle to go have tea with her. I walked into that house, which I'd driven by before, and I just felt as if a whole new world had opened. Then she walked around and started moving all the walls around and unfolding the beds, showing how this space could be one spaces, two spaces, three spaces, four spaces, how it could adapt to the rhythms of a small family, how it responded to its geography, how it really, in all of its abstraction, was a living place. At the end of all of that, she said, oh my goodness, it really has gotten to be warm. And she walked up to the window in the corner, unlashed both sides of it, and opened the corner so that suddenly the corner disappeared. And I felt like the whole of the outside was rushing in and all of the inside was rushing out. I think that was the moment that I really decided I loved modernist architecture and wanted to do something with it, to have that kind of openness, freedom, liberty, that sense of release, that sense that everything can become part of a completely constructed reality that you can control and that you can discover. It was very exciting to me. So over the years, I became more and more involved in architecture, both in trying to make it, which I turned out to be less successful at, but also in teaching and writing about architecture, design, and art. And I remained fundamentally interested in this notion of an architecture that should represent modernity, the world that we live in today. As I constructed the book, the argument became a little bit more perhaps strident than that, which is to say that the book argues very briefly that the built environment as we know it today was largely built by and for one group of people, one class of people, those people we call the middle class or the bourgeoisie. These were the people who were not of a place in the sense that they were born there, they worked the land, they were part of the land, nor were they above the land and owning it, living in isolated castles or grand palaces. They were actually somewhere in between. This was the class of people who lived in cities and urban environments, the people who also had to make a social relationship for themselves, an artificial world, a social world, a mental world, a project that of course we know as the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and then the Industrial Revolution. My argument is that architecture is part of that project that creates the scenography for this middle class, but beyond that, makes a place that is their own, that stands in contrast to the physical world, also stands in contrast to the spiritual or abstract world, and is rather power realized and operating in the real world. It's how you make a place for yourself in that floating space of the middle world. It's how you make yourself at home when you have to literally build your own home. It's not something you inherit. It's not something you get by crawling into a cave. It's something that you have to construct. And for me, the project of modernism in architecture is the making of that artificial world, and it's that project that I really try to describe in this book. I think that the modernist project in architecture is still the continual construction of that artificial world. You know, it has grown in scale and complexity to such a degree that it now encompasses most of the globe and reaches into the very minutiae of the objects we use every day, can literally restage our environments with much more power than we once were able to, and even enters into our very body and perception, so that the boundaries between the inside of the body and the outside become difficult to ascertain. But it is true that, as many critics have pointed out, and I'm not claiming that I invented anything, first lesson I learned in architecture school was, if you like it, steal it. So I like to think that I'm repurposing what other people have said. But the project of modernism, you could say that it reached its peak of clarity, ambition, and optimism somewhere, probably, if you want to be as precise as possible, somewhere right before the First World War, sometime right around the visual experiments that responded, at least in part, to the advances in science and the social unrest of this period, somewhere around 1910. Ever since then, the modernist project has been more and more racked with doubts. Not that it wasn't already, but those doubts really became more and more prevalent. The contradictions became much more apparent. The sense of a single-minded clarity about what one should do dissipated into many different directions, and irony, even satire, began to set in, as well as a dystopian aspect to the project, a nihilistic sense, which, of course, everything happens in other fields much earlier, had already happened in literature and various other fields. Architects, being very slow learners, I think, didn't really come to a full realization of this until after 1973, the falling apart of the social democratic consensus that had until then saved not only the politics but also the aesthetics of modernity. And that is when what the architect Charles Jenks, who was actually the person who coined that phrase, termed postmodernism, came to the fore. Now that those books are in their 89th or whatever edition, and we can see the architects who were then the revolutionaries of that period as our grandfathers or great-grandfathers, very few grandmothers, I think we realize that it was just another version of modernity. And for a while there were so many arguments about postmodernism, late modernism, post-postmodernism, remodernism. To me, that is all less interesting than trying to figure out how modernism is responding to a much less uniform, much more complex, and much more difficult to grasp clientele, if you will, and landscape in which it must unfold. So it is harder and harder to describe the closer you get to the present. I just ran into the architect Robert A.N. Stern checking into the hotel just now, and I knew through a source that he was actually reading my book, which I thought was quite a compliment, and I said, nice to see you. How did you like my book? And he gave me one of his withering stares, and I said, oh, I guess you didn't like it. And he said, no, you did a very nice job. I just wish I had 15 years to write a complete refutation of it. And to me, that is a perfect endorsement of what I was trying to do. I would hope that you should read the book because you love modernism, that somewhere deep inside you believe that we can build a better world, and that even though we know that it is a world that is imperfect and represses many things, from our inner self to many groups of people who have been excluded from that world. It has a possibility of being open. It has a possibility of being, as Wolf Prix likes to say, an open architecture of the open heart, the open eye, and the open mind. And that, to me, is what modernism really can do. And this book argues that if you take modernism seriously and understand that it was a real social and economic project that was necessary and wasn't just an aesthetic infatuation or affectation, but that it actually had a real role in creating the world that we now all inhabit together, then maybe you can figure out what to do with it and how to make it better. As an architect, you have to have the knowledge and discipline that is native to architecture, which is to say that which is about building. However, the argument that I make is on the other side of that, which is that buildings turn out not to be very good ways to make architecture. So you have to reach beyond what you know to apply those skills, that discipline, to other fields, whether it's to interiors, which is what architects wind up doing most of the time because those are the jobs they get, to landscapes, or even to completely other fields of endeavor, politics, movies, cooking, I don't know. I think that architecture as a way of seeing and knowing your world through its physical appearance is a very powerful tool to act in that world. If you walk around or drive around an urban environment or a suburban environment with the knowledge and skills that are particular to architecture, you can see in that environment the relationships of power and the history of how they came to be. You can see where the money is if you want to follow the money. You can see where the money is. You can see the way in which human beings have created relationships with each other and with the world around them. And if you see that, then you can change it. So architects need to have those basic skills, but they need to apply them beyond buildings.